Why is it that, well, let me ask you this. Do you believe that there's something about Hispanics and African Americans that prevents them from taking the bar exam and doing well on it? Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Welcome to both of the nominees. Justice Montgomery, you served as a co-chair of the Delaware Supreme Court's Diversity and Strategic Planning Steering Committee. The committee drafted a series of recommendations to improve the diversity of the Delaware legal profession. The report stated that the bar exam, quote, likely serves as a barrier to the racial and ethnic diversity of attorneys in Delaware, and recommended the creation of an alternative to the bar exam based on clerkships and recommendations. Justice Montgomery, I find that a remarkable recommendation. I'm Hispanic. I took the bar. I'm confident you took the bar and passed it. You and I have both known many extraordinary lawyers who are African American and Hispanic, who've taken the bar, who practiced, who served exemplary careers. Why is it that well, let me ask you this. Do you believe that there's something about Hispanics and African Americans that prevents them from taking the bar exam and doing well on it?
Thank you for the question, Senator. That was a committee that was made up of a broad cross-section of attorneys, of judges, of citizens.
Justice, we have really limited time, so I would appreciate if you just answer the specific question.
Can you repeat the specific question?
Sure. Do you believe there's something about Hispanics and African Americans that prevents them from taking the bar exam and doing well on it?
No, I do not, Senator.
And do you believe, as you look at our cadre of attorneys, that what we really need is more people licensed to practice law who for whatever reason, can't pass the bar exam?
Senator, the recommendation that you read is a recommendation to the Delaware Supreme Court. The Delaware Supreme Court has not acted on that recommendation at all.
Do you agree with the recommendation, though? You were co-chair of the committee that made the recommendation. Is that right?
I was a co-chair of the committee, but I did not vote on the recommendation.
Do you agree with the recommendation?
I think that our Supreme Court would need to study very closely that recommendation, and it's not a recommendation that the Supreme Court itself has studied yet, and not a recommendation that we've accepted yet.
As co-chair of the committee that made the recommendation, did you examine the recommendations that your committee was making before it made them?
So this was not a situation where the Supreme Court or the co-chair was even directing the recommendation. We were truly soliciting information from others, and they made the recommendation.
I'm going to try again, and I know in your role as a judge, you ask questions and you expect counsel to answer them. So did you examine the recommendations of the committee you were co-chairing before the recommendations were made?
I saw the recommendations. I did not make an edit to any recommendation.
Okay. Ms. Chung, you've served as United States Attorney in Pennsylvania. You're also on the Attorney General's Advisory Committee. You have spoken publicly about the Attorney General's TEN initiative, Trafficking Ends Now. Do you think it's important to stop human trafficking?
Senator, as United States Attorney, we have dedicated many resources to prosecuting trafficking, human trafficking.
Let me ask you, to what extent do you think the Biden administration's refusal to enforce the law, which has resulted in 3.5 million people crossing illegally in the last year and a half, the highest rate of illegal immigration in 62 years. To what extent has that lawlessness from the department in which you work right now contributed to and fueled the human trafficking crisis we're seeing?
Well, Senator, when I take up as a prosecutor, now as United States Attorney, supervise human trafficking cases, they're very fact-specific as to each case.
Would human trafficking be less if the Biden administration enforced the law?
Well, Senator, there is trafficking across borders, but also within our borders, so I would have to...
Does catch and release contribute to human trafficking?
Senator, I do not have enough research or study on that to
You don't know?
that to know the answer to.
You've been the chief prosecutor for a significant portion of Pennsylvania, and you don't know whether 3.5 million people coming in illegally because the Biden DOJ won't enforce the law. You don't know if that contributes to trafficking?
Senator, again, when we address human trafficking, it is on a case-to-case basis.
Okay, well, let me ask you this. Right now, fentanyl is the leading cause of death for Americans 18 to 45. It has exploded under Joe Biden's refusal to enforce our border. Has that policy contributed to the over 100,000 people who've died of fentanyl overdoses in the past year?
Senator, again, when we prosecute our fentanyl cases.
Okay, you're declining to answer. Let me ask one final question. Last week, the White House press secretary said in front of the National Press Corps that people aren't walking across the border. It's just not happening. Was that a true statement?
Senator, I'm not familiar with that statement.
But is it true that no one is walking across the border and crossing illegally? Is that an accurate statement?
Senator, I do not have
You
the
don't know?
knowledge basis.
How do you prosecute a human trafficking case if you don't know where the people are being trafficked, how they're being trafficked?
Well, Senator, when we do prosecute those human trafficking cases, it is on a case-to-case basis, and in those instances, we do know where they're coming from. It is often interstate. The human trafficking statutes are about forced labor, and that can be from state to state. It can be across borders.
Thank you.
Senator Hawley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Congratulations to the nominees. Thank you for being here. Ms. Chung, let me start with you. You were talking just a minute ago, I think, about human trafficking with Senator Cruz. Is that right? Did I hear that right? And this has been a priority of yours, I think, in your work as U.S. Attorney. Is that correct? Fair to say?
Yes, Senator.
So you are on an advisory committee to the U.S. Attorney General, to Merrick Garland. Is that right?
Yes.
And you stated in your questionnaire that this advisory committee, and this is your quote, elevates the voices of U.S. attorneys in department policies. Have I got that right?
Yes.
And one of those policies is combating human trafficking, correct?
Certainly.
You have talked a lot about the importance of anti-trafficking efforts, and human trafficking, just so we're all clear, includes sex trafficking, of course, but also includes labor trafficking. Is that right?
That's right, Senator.
And you probably prosecuted some of these cases. Is that correct?
I have been involved in allegations of forced labor.
Yeah.
Cases involving allegations of forced labor.
Understood. So when we're talking about labor trafficking, we're also talking about kidnapping and human smuggling across the southern border. Is that right?
Cases of forced labor can certainly involve those types of activities.
So the New York Times reported just a month or two ago this fact, and I'm going to quote now from the Times. Migrant smuggling on the U.S. southern border has evolved over the past 10 years from a scattered network of freelance coyotes into a multi-billion dollar, that's a billion with a B, multi-billion dollar international business controlled by organized crime, including some of Mexico's most violent drug cartels. And then the Times goes on to report about the cartels kidnapping children so that illegal immigrants can try to pose as asylum-seeking families. We've heard reports about women being abducted and raped as part of illegal immigration rings. We hear about cartels kidnapping and torturing other people, holding them for ransom until their relatives in the U.S. pay to have them released, and then illegally smuggling them into the United States. I'm sure you're familiar with this. I mean, this is the work that you do. All of this is human trafficking. All of it is tragic, and all of it is increasing. So here's what I'm coming around to. I'm just curious about your work with the Attorney General. Are you advising him to crack down on human trafficking at the border? Are you advising him to enforce our immigration laws at the border to stop this terror that is occurring with women and children in particular, but frankly, involving all people, labor trafficking, sex trafficking? Are you advising him to this on this topic and to this end?
Senator Hawley, as a member of the Attorney General's Advisory Committee, I can speak to the fact that I'm on that and that we do, when asked, provide input of the United States Attorney's community positions on issues.
Has he asked about this issue? Has he asked about, given your expertise in trafficking, has he asked about how to stop the crisis of labor trafficking and sex trafficking at our southern border?
Well, certainly violent crime is a very high priority for the Department of Justice, and one that is frequently discussed.
But does he have a plan to stop the trafficking at the border? Are you involved in that? Have you been involved in any work to develop a plan to stop the sexual exploitation of women and children, to stop the exploitation of migrant workers into this country, to stop the exploitation of these vulnerable populations by cartels and organized crime? Have you been involved in a plan, developing a plan to stop that at DOJ?
And Senator, the reason I just want to be careful that I'm speaking to what I can talk about publicly, but of course I can't speak to deliberative or work product. But what I can say is that I have not been asked to weigh in on the specific issue that you have asked.
It's too bad. Go ahead.
However, as a member of the Department of Justice and as a United States Attorney, violent crime has been my top priority, and I have done much to try to address that.
Well, I'm disappointed that the Attorney General's panel has not looked at human trafficking, but I can't say I'm surprised, because this Attorney General and this administration, frankly, has turned a blind eye to the crisis at our border that comes at a very real cost, a very, very real cost that you know, because you've seen these crimes. You've seen the results of this, and you've seen the results of what happens when you allow organized crime and violent cartels to control our border and to use human beings as assets to be traded upon and exploited in order to drive their profits. And that's what's happening every day, and this administration's allowing it. Justice Montgomery Reeves, let me come to you just briefly. You've been asked several times, I've heard the questions about your work as co-chair of the Delaware Supreme Court's Diversity Strategic Planning Steering Committee. That's a mouthful, but you've been asked about this. I just want to ask you about one thing in the report. The report talks about how important it is for the Delaware Supreme Court, I'm going to quote now, to take steps to reduce implicit bias and identity threat in the court environment. And it goes on to say that one of the things that might reduce identity threat is to get rid of the historic portraits of some of the white justices who've served on the court. Can you explain to me what identity threat is and why getting rid of portraits of judges and justices who've served on the courts would help with that?
Thank you so much for the question, Senator. I am not familiar with the term identity threat, so I don't have a definition for you. I can give you a definition of.
It's in the report, though. I mean, I'm quoting, to take steps to reduce implicit bias and identity threat in the court environment. I mean, this is your report.
Well, I understand, but one thing that I've attempted to explain is that I didn't draft the report. We had an entire committee that was creating a report to be delivered to the Supreme Court.
You signed off on it, though, didn't you?
So there wasn't a sign-off necessarily on the report.
Your name's on it, though.
I understand. I was a co-chair of the committee, but I didn't draft all the words to the report. I didn't draft the recommendations to the report. The Supreme Court is considering the report, and we haven't done anything with that particular recommendation.
So you don't know what identity threat is?
Well, I did not put those words in there, and I'm not entirely sure what whoever drafted that specific one meant by that one.
It seems kind of crazy to me, I have to say. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I want to clarify this, because you've had three people ask questions about it. I think I get the answer. Apparently, it's still in doubt to some. We're talking about recommendations made by a committee to you. Is that correct?
That's correct.
These are not recommendations that you personally wrote or were involved in writing?
That's correct.
You did not vote for or against those recommendations?
That's correct.
Some other body is now deciding if there's any action to be taken?
The Supreme Court is considering what to do with the recommendations.
That's pretty clear, isn't it? And the questions that have been asked over and over again suggest otherwise, and you've said over and over again just what I said. So I think, is there anything more you want to say on the subject to make sure it's clear?
Thank you for the chance to clarify, Chairman. What happened is that there was a committee that was created to analyze diversity in Delaware. In the bar, that committee was purposefully made up of a large group of people who have an interest in the issue to consider the issue. The Supreme Court wanted to get people's honest views about what the recommendations might be. So we did not identify, exclude, tell people what they should think or make as recommendations. We accepted the recommendations that were provided to us, and now the Supreme Court is considering which recommendations it will and will not take and implement.
Mr. Chairman.
Certainly, Senator Kennedy.
Mr. Chairman, I think you mischaracterized my questions.
Oh, no, sir, I wasn't referring to you at all.
I'm glad to hear that, because my questions of the judge were, and I never got an answer, did she agree or disagree with the recommendations?
Senator, I was not referring to you at all. You've asked that question, and most nominees have given the same answer as these nominees, but it's your right to ask that question. And so I was referring to this so-called report involving the Supreme
I
Court.
was too. And if you have a second round, I'm going to ask it again.
Well, there's
Does
no plan.
does the judge agree or disagree with the recommendations?
Senator,
I'm not really interested in how many lawyers can dance on the head of a pin.
Senator,
I'm just interested in hearing whether the judge agrees or disagrees.
Senator, you're doing the same thing that we've done when the tables were turned. Try to get these nominees to say what their personal views are, and most of them think it through and believe that they can't do that, and it makes them sound as if they don't have a personal
Well,
view.
Mr. Chairman, I think that's the purpose of the Judiciary
Well, you're
Committee.
entitled to your opinion.
Let me just finish my thought. I'm entitled to my opinion. I mean, we're confirming these nominees for lifetime appointments. They're not elected. You don't think it's relevant what they believe?
I think you create a problem for them that jeopardizes their role as judges.
When I just ask them what they believe?
May I finish my thought?
Certainly, I apologize.
Okay, thank you very much. I think that they understand that if they start expressing their personal views, as Ms. Chung has said repeatedly, it's a forecast of the future, and they're trying their best to say law, facts, precedent, and stick with it. And I think that's what we expect of judges.
Well, I just disagree, Mr. Chairman. I think people's personal beliefs, have they thought about the world? Have they thought about the issues that are central to American democracy? I think that's perfectly appropriate. I'm surprised that no, and this isn't meant to be personal, but that you haven't directed the witnesses to answer our questions.
We asked the same question to Trump nominees and got the same response. This is a predictable course of action on this committee. We try to probe as deeply as we can, and witnesses don't always go along with the extent of our probe.
Well, recently they never do.
Well, under Trump's nominees, they never did either.
Well, I questioned them too, as you recall.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, can I just, since I think that last back and forth was directed implicitly at me, I think you factually misstated the record, though. And maybe I'm wrong.
Let's get this straight, because I.
Well, can I just Yeah. Sure. So here's, I think, maybe I'm wrong about this. I thought that the justice was the co-chair of this Diversity Strategic Planning Steering Committee, and that entity issued a report to the Delaware Supreme Court. You said that some group made recommendations to the justice. I don't think that's right. I think she co-chaired a committee that made recommendations to the Delaware Supreme Court, and her testimony's been the Supreme Court hasn't acted on those recommendations.
Let her respond.
Sure.
It is correct that I'm the co-chair of the committee that made the recommendations, but what I was trying to clarify is that there's a subgroup. There are 5 subgroups that made recommendations. During those deliberations, the co-chairs, myself and the Chief Justice, did not make recommendations. We did not identify specific recommendations for people. We didn't strike down recommendations for people. We didn't say, yes, we like those, no, we don't like the other ones. We allowed the subcommittees to create their own recommendations. We didn't change the recommendations at all as they went into the report. And those recommendations went in as is to the Supreme Court. And as the entire Supreme Court, our analysis as the Chief Justice and myself would be with the rest of the Supreme Court.
Understood. My only point, Mr. Chairman, is, and I think what I heard Senator Cruz's question. I can't speak for him. I'll just speak for myself. My point is that the justice co-chaired the panel. I think it's reasonable to ask her about the content of the report that they made. And if she doesn't want to answer the questions per your exchange with Senator Kennedy, that's fine.
The suggestion is she's dodging the question. How much more explicit can she be? The presumption seems to be that she wrote the recommendations, and it's clear she did not. She said it repeatedly, and you won't accept it. That's just a fact. And so it is an unusual situation, but best I can determine, she gathered the information and passed it along without a vote of approval or without any scrutiny on her person.
But, Mr. Chairman, I just respectfully disagree. I don't think, that's not what I asked the witness. I asked her, does she agree or disagree with the recommendations?
Well,
Forget the report.
That's another question, Senator.
But I never got an answer.
Oh, and I don't think you would from a Trump nominee either.
But we don't have Trump. I pressed a lot of Trump nominees, as you well know, and voted against a bunch of them. And they helped kill 4 or 5 that I didn't think were qualified. But I don't agree with your revisionist history, no disrespect, in the last 10 minutes. I asked the witness 4 or 5 times, do you agree or disagree? And I didn't get an answer. Now, you can call that dodging the question. If you want to, that's a little pejorative to me, but I never got an answer, and I don't think that's inappropriate for me to ask. That's the issue.